Hello everyone, I am Isabel, the curator at the museum, and I would like to thank you for joining our Brown Bag Lunch this month. It's a lecture series that takes place every first Wednesday of the month. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to please ensure that your phone is set to silent mode. Thank you. I'm going to start by sharing with you some upcoming events. September 6th, we'll have tickets on sale for the Graveside Chronicles. It's a special walking tour at Bosque Bello Cemetery, and that will be on October 12th. This event is in partnership with the Amelia Island Genealogical Society. The next event at the museum will be on September 20th. We'll have our exhibit opening for our quarterly temporary exhibit. And it will be about Fernandina and Nassau County, the ties that bind. We'll be talking about the railroad and the new communities that grew around the railroad. We'll have for the guest speaker John Hendricks, who is the president of West Nassau Historical Society. And the exhibit you can see around you, that's thanks to John Hendricks. I have one more that brings us to October 4th. That will be our next Brown Bag Lunch. And we will be talking about what will be happening after the Civil War, the reconstruction, and that will be with docent Jonathan Bryan. Now let me introduce you Holly, who has been a volunteer at the Amelia Island Museum of History for 2 years, leading docent tours, Central Street tours, and ghost tours. When she's not volunteering at the museum, Holly works remotely as an IT and procurement project manager for a restaurant company. She also volunteers with the annual Isle of Eight Flags Shrimp Festival. Now, if you have followed our Brown Bag lecture this year, you may know that the program is focusing on the 8 flags that have flown over Amelia Island. In today's presentation, Holly will introduce you to the 8th flag, which takes us back to the time of the Civil War. What was life like here during that era? I will leave you in Holly's capable hands to explore Fernandina during the Civil War.
Thank you. Let me know if y'all in the back can't hear me or anything like that, but I will try to speak up. Let me start by saying I definitely got lucky getting to do this Brown Bag Lunch. The one on the flag was so much material. Some of them are a lot shorter than this one, so I got pretty lucky. The information that's been documented about the Civil War in Fernandina is extensive and fascinating, and I could go on for quite a while, but I tried to pull some of the most interesting tidbits of my research out and weave them somewhat coherently together to present today. I also know that we've got a lot of Civil War and Fernandina Beach experts in the room, but also some people that might be new to the area or not know this period of history as much, so we'll try to meet somewhere in the middle, but we'll definitely leave room for questions at the end if anyone has any. But let's dive right in, I guess, and begin by going back to the years before the war in Fernandina Beach to set the stage and paint the picture. Florida had only been a state for a couple of years since 1845, having been a territory for the 20 years prior. Florida was a rugged frontier with less than 250,000 people living in it, and only about half of those inhabitants were white. Here in Fernandina Beach prior to the war, we had not only white residents, but also Native people and free African Americans as well, making this a fairly diverse corner of the state. This map came from one of the books downstairs and paints a really interesting, paints a very interesting picture of what Florida looked like at the time. You can see up in this northeast corner, there's less than 2 inhabitants per square mile in this corner of Florida, and pretty much everyone was centered in Tallahassee. Florida's decision to secede from the Union was not reached by popular vote, but by delegates sent to the secession convention. 2 of these delegates, Joseph Finnegan and J.G. Cooper, came from Nassau County here. Most of the delegates of the convention were planters and who had connections and interest in supporting the Confederate cause, whether or not they really, accurately depicted the rest of Florida's sentiments about the secession. In fact, the vast majority of Florida's population weren't slave owners, but were actually working on smaller farms, cattle ranches, timber farms, manufacturing, or other similar jobs, and so had little reason to support secession. Despite this, it appears that most Floridians saw the writing on the wall and saw secession as a question of when and not if. We became the third state to leave the Union after only 7 of the 69 delegates at that convention voted against seceding. If people didn't agree with the decision, they pretty much kept it to themselves. They mostly probably suspected some small battles, some small disagreements, but not the full-scale war that would break out a couple of years later, or later on that year. Throughout the course of the war, about 15,000 Floridians would be sent to fight for the Confederacy, and roughly 5,000 of those men died, one of the highest percentages of any state involved in the war. Joseph Finnegan, who I mentioned is one of the delegates from here in Nassau County, was called Fernandina Beach home. Actually, that is a picture of Joseph Finnegan. He became a Confederate general, helping to win the Battle of Olustee in North Florida, and he also went on to command the Florida Brigade in General Lee's army later in the war. Remember his name, because we'll come back to him a couple times. But let's zoom in and focus on Fernandina Beach specifically. Throughout the late 1850s, the biggest news in town was the creation of the Florida Railroad. I won't go too in-depth about the railroad because that's a whole topic on its own, but a conversation about Civil War in Fernandina Beach wouldn't be complete without at least a little railroad in there. David Yulee, here's a picture of David Yulee, had already established himself as a politician in the 1840s. He was defeated in the election of 1850, and he redirected his energy at that point to his other big life goal of establishing a cross-state railroad. He originally planned for it to be state-owned, but ended up deciding just to build it himself. He started by buying up land in we're at downtown now, and picked Cedar Key for the other terminus on the other side of the state. The Florida Railroad was chartered in 1853. Yulee became president of the company, and construction began in 1855. Anson Bangs had the first construction contract, but after a matter of months, Joseph Finnegan, who we've already talked about, and company took over construction of the railroad. The first train ran the 155 miles through the Florida wilderness on March 1st, 1861. Being the terminus of the largest railroad in Florida at the time made Fernandina Beach an attractive city to live in. We boasted a population of a little less than 1,500 inhabitants, a lighthouse, a busy harbor, and a partially completed fort, Fort Clinch. The building of Fort Clinch began in the late 1840s to guard the mouth of the St. Mary's River, protect shipping channels, and defend Fernandina Beach. But just as many construction projects do today, its construction progressed slowly. It was only about 2/3 complete by the beginning of the war, and that was over a decade after the construction had already started. The majority of the labor was supplied by enslaved people, and construction only progressed in fall and winter, making it a very slow construction project. By 1860, the walls facing the St. Mary's River, the guardhouse, the drawbridge, and the prison were completed, but the storehouses and the kitchens were at various stages of completion. The rest wasn't even started, and there were barely any guns in place. The first thing to happen in the area around the time of Florida's secession was for Confederate forces to take over Fort Clinch. This group was made up of locals, not professional soldiers or anything, but were a small part of the Florida secessionist militia that eventually belonged to the 3rd Regiment of Florida Volunteers. No shots were fired, since there was no significant federal presence to resist the takeover, and they placed Colonel W.S. Dilworth in charge. Soldiers were stationed all over the island, with focuses on areas like Old Town, Fort Clinch, and the Harrison Plantation down on the south end of the island where the Omni is now. After the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the war began in earnest, and the newly formed Confederacy needed a strategy. In late 1861 and early 1862, General Robert E. Lee visited the eastern coast's defenses as far south as Amelia Island. Part of his trip included a stop up on Cumberland Island to visit his father, Light Horse Harry Lee's grave. Harry Lee was buried on Cumberland in Nathaniel Greene's family plot and was marked by a plain marble slab that drew the general briefly away from his inspection of the coastal defenses here in Northeast Florida. As I mentioned, Florida was a newer state that was made up of isolated populations, and the majority of fighting was occurring in Northern Virginia, the Western Front. This quote here is from a letter from General Lee to his daughter, explaining, "I've been down the coast to Amelia Island to examine the defenses. They are poor indeed. And I have laid off work enough to employ our people a month. I hope our enemy will be polite enough to wait for us. It is difficult to get our people to realize their positions." Basically, Lee determined that the volunteers that were manning the fort would be unable to defend it well and could be better utilized elsewhere. So General Lee ordered the evacuation of the area in February 1862. Confederate forces originally started evacuating the area on March 1st. Artillery was moved inland over into Yulee, destroyed, or sent to other forts for immediate use. Locals were slower to respond to the evacuation order, though. They even had to issue a second order informing citizens of a special train that would be leaving, especially for women and children, although not many people seemed to take advantage of that train. Despite the lack of response, the Union troops were closing in, capturing Cumberland Island on March 1st. As residents started to understand what was coming their way and the situation that they found themselves in, they started to move and started to evacuate. By the time the USS Ottawa, which was a Union gunboat that was outfitted with 13 guns, made its way to Fernandina Beach, about 1,300 soldiers and most of the residents of Fernandina Beach had evacuated, leaving only 200 people in town to greet that ship. Now, if y'all have taken the museum's docent tour, you know about this period, of history. You know this next part of the story. Railroad workers, town ministers, David Yulee himself, were on that last train out as the USS Ottawa pulled up to Amelia Island. As I'm sure you know, the railroad track on the island runs parallel to the river, allowing the Ottawa to chase after the train as it left the station. There were 2 railroad workers on the last car. It was a flat car filled with furniture, waving to the Union ship as it pulled up to the harbor. The Ottawa opened fire on the train, hitting that last car, killing those 2 men, but not preventing the rest of the train to make its way to the mainland into safety. This is a picture of what is believed to be one of the cannonballs that was fired at the train. This one was fired but didn't explode. There's a fun story about this cannonball, or I think it's fun. In 2016, a ranger from Fort Clinch was brought here to the museum to evaluate it and see if it really could be one of the cannonballs fired from the Ottawa. He determined it would be a match for what would have been fired from the ship, and based on where it was found, that it was in the correct location where it would make sense based on the Ottawa's trajectory. As he looked at it, he wanted to make sure there wasn't any gunpowder inside, because gunpowder becomes less stable as it ages, causing potential explosions. The museum was evacuated. The sheriff, fire department, and bomb squad came to the museum to remove the cannonball. The bomb squad determined there was gunpowder that needed to be removed, took care of it, made sure that it was safe, and returned this to the museum once the gunpowder was removed. If you were interested in seeing this fragment of a cannonball, it will be on display in the exhibit opening on September 20th that Isabel talked about, so definitely worth coming back and seeing in person. Although it's not cool.
It will not explode.
No, yeah, you're totally safe. We can guarantee it now. Back to the story. After the train made it to the mainland, the USS Ottawa decided to pursue a nearby Confederate steamer named the Darlington. This is a reproduction of the Darlington. It was filled with Confederate Army supplies, personnel, and local women and children. The Ottawa opened fire on the Darlington in the harbor, causing it to run ashore. The captain was arrested while the ship was taken for federal use. While Union troops came ashore, Union Commodore Samuel DuPont disagreed with Robert E. Lee's assessment of Fort Clinch and determined that it was not only defensible but worth finishing. Sounds like the following days were pretty rough for those 200 people who stayed on the island. There's a picture of some of the drawing of some of the federal troops marching through the streets. Some of those buildings you might recognize. The Union soldiers, about 1 for every resident left, ransacked the town and drunkenly terrorized those people that were left in town. Over time, the relationship improved between Union troops and locals, as well as the refugees. Amelia Island remained in Union control for the remainder of the war, while the rest of Nassau County remained in Confederate territory. The main use of Amelia Island for the Union forces was to be a coaling station for the Federal blockade ships. The Union had enforced a blockade of the entire Confederate coastline, requiring the Federal Navy to quickly and strategically grow. This access to blockaded goods made Amelia Island a fairly comfortable place to be stationed throughout the war, but I'll come back to that in a little bit and why this was a pretty good place to be located. Under Union authority, Amelia Island assumed another role it had previously played when it was under Spanish rule. It was a sanctuary for runaway slaves. So much so that by 1863, 1,200 refugees had joined those 200 residents that had been left after the evacuation. Not long after that, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1863. Troops came to Fernandina Beach with copies of the Emancipation Proclamation promising freedom for slaves and allowing African Americans into the Union Army for the first time. Fernandina Beach became a major place of recruitment for these first officially sanctioned Union troops that they were recruiting. 100 African American recruits from Fernandina joined the Union troops, followed by 200 more a month later from Fernandina Beach and St. Augustine. Many of these recruits were former slaves with a new mission, along with other orders, that was, quote, to carry the proclamation of freedom to the enslaved. By the end of the war, 9 different black regiments had served in Fernandina Beach, tasked with duties including raids into Confederate territory, security, recruiting, and rebuilding the railroad, which at this point had been taken apart by Confederate troops to build more direct supply lines to where the fighting was going on further north. I was recently asked on one of my docent tours about the rumor that Harriet Tubman had been here, spent some time here on Amelia Island. She was associated with the 33rd Colored Troops in multiple roles: nurse, cook, scout, and even spy. There's a letter from a commander in the War Department that said, "Send Harriet," asking for her assistance in treating an outbreak of dysentery among the troops in Fernandina Beach. I don't have a picture to show of it, but her visit was documented in the journals of soldiers that were stationed at Fort Clinch. That brings up the question of what life was like here on the island for the residents, soldiers, and refugees that found themselves here throughout the war. As I mentioned before, there's only about 200 residents left that didn't evacuate, and about 5 to 10 times that many Union troops on the island. There was also a large group of refugees, somewhere between 5 and 1,500, that came to the island looking for protection and food. These refugees consisted of a variety of people, including freed and runaway slaves, indentured servants, Native Americans, and some displaced whites. Remember, the Union blockade was affecting the entire coastline, and there were some blockade runners getting through, some materials coming in, but not enough to make things comfortable. And despite Florida being an agricultural state, we didn't have the infrastructure in place to get these goods across the state to these small remote towns. As you saw at the beginning, there was only a few people on the side of the state. There was no major roads. They were basically cow paths that people could take across the state, but not any infrastructure to be able to transport goods en masse. This was even worse for African Americans who were trying to make their way through the Confederate South, and Amelia Island offered Union protection. Throughout the war, along with war and refugees, come orphans and widows, and a woman named Chloe Merrick, this is a picture of her, stepped in to help. Chloe Merrick grew up in a well-to-do abolitionist-minded family in Syracuse, New York, and trained to be a teacher. In 1862, she volunteered along with Cornelia Smith to become a teacher for the Federal Freedmen's Relief Association in Fernandina Beach. During her first 6 months on the island, her integrated class grew from 150 to 330 students. As she did home visits and learned about the lives of her students, the need for an orphanage to combat the hunger and the lack of adequate clothing became apparent. So Chloe decided to open an orphanage. Now, remember Joseph Finnegan, we've talked about him a couple times already. Since he was off fighting, he hadn't paid his property taxes on this beautiful home. He basically that allowed it to be opened up for sale. With the financial and logistical help of local and military officials, Merrick was able to buy the home to create her orphanage. She then started fundraising through connections in Syracuse. The orphanage was opened in that building in 1864, and within a year and a half, she had 50 children in her care. Over time, her work gained attention, which in turn helped her fund her efforts to help the women and children here in Fernandina Beach. Of course, with so many children, food was always an issue. She had to rely on military rations, and the children helped plant gardens to supplement. She also faced problems once the war was finished and when the sale of the Finnegan house came into question when Joseph returned to town. In 1866, the orphanage was moved to Jacksonville and ultimately closed. Despite what happened after the war, Chloe Merrick dedicated her life to improving the state's education and social services, and served Fernandina Beach and its most valuable citizens with passion, impacting thousands of people's lives for the better, especially during the war years. Now, Fernandina, being a Union stronghold, allowed for a little more comfort than other stations if you were a soldier throughout the war. But it could still be rough. There was always the threat of illness, injury, not a lot of food to go around, and of course, bugs. Here's a letter from Samuel Walcott. You can't really see the writing, but there's a quote on the side, of the 7th Connecticut, complaining about the quantity of gnats and mosquitoes here. A pair of drawers and pants with rubber and woolen blankets are nothing for them to bite through. Something we all can still relate to. In the same letter, Walcott complains that it's very dull here. There's no excitement, nothing but guard and drill, painting a pretty good snapshot of what Fort Clinch was like during the war. Hot, with a lot of bugs and not a lot of action. There were these occasional skirmishes during the occasional raid into Confederate territory, and there were Union gunboats stationed near the fort patrolling the river, but no large-scale battles to note. There was even occasionally an opportunity for trading between the two sides. Union soldiers could row over to Georgia in small boats and offer to trade items like coffee and tobacco and paper. Union troops worked on drills and continuing construction on Fort Clinch, but now with refugees hired for labor and materials brought down from the north. So if you go to Fort Clinch, you can see about halfway up some of the walls, the color of the bricks change because they were originally sourcing them from the south, and then midway through the war, they start sourcing them from the north, changing the colors a little bit. Food was adequate on the island, but maybe not particularly appetizing, and stretched a little thin between the troops and the continuously increasing refugees. They had military rations and local crops and a farm of fresh vegetables on Talbot Island just south of us, making it a much better situation than the Confederate-controlled mainland, where food shortages were much more severe just right across the river. An average day's meals for soldiers at Fort Clinch consisted of things like salt pork and hardtack for breakfast, basically biscuits, and then salt beef, potatoes, and bread for lunch and dinner, accompanied by plenty of vegetables like string beans, peas, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and cabbage that they could grow locally. Coffee and sugar were also available. And if you know the Stark building on Center Street, or if you've been on the Center Street tour, it's now home to the Christmas store, and they just took the scaffolding down. It was once the Stark Bakery, and they provided freshly baked bread to the fort throughout the war. But of course, your access to that bread and the quality and freshness of the food you ate depended on your rank within the Army. Of course, the higher ranking officials got the better food. Drinking was supposed to be prohibited, but the soldiers were able to get whiskey from the quartermaster if the soldier had a doctor's note for the whiskey, so a lot of them had doctor's notes. They were also sick a lot too, but they didn't cause too many problems. They tried to stop the shipments coming in, but they found their way, especially when it's medicine, I guess. But the threat of illness such as malaria, tuberculosis, measles, and dysentery were always a threat because sanitation wasn't really understood or appreciated at the time. For entertainment, soldiers did a lot of the same things we do today. Fishing, swimming. They played music and games such as bowling and an early form of baseball called rounders. They also had access to newspapers and church services within the fort. Most of the soldiers' supplies were provided by the quartermaster, who lived within the fort as well. They were usually given 1 bar of soap and 3 candles for the week, and were required to take at least a weekly bath. They were also provided with ponchos, mosquito netting, and 6 sets of clothing per year, and 1/2 of a tent. Half of the men had the part of the tent with buttons, and the other half had the part with the holes. And so if they needed to set up a tent, one would yell buttons, someone else would yell holes, until you found somebody, matched up, and made yourself a tent for the evening. The officers, the higher ranking guys, had more comfortable bunks stuffed with Spanish moss, which poses its own discomfort when you think about the chiggers and the other things that might be in that bed. So, yeah, neither were their best choice. But more about what their life was like. If you've been through the museum, you've probably seen a set of shoes, I think they're women's shoes, that are on display downstairs. They don't appear to have a clear left or right foot. They don't really have one. That's because prior to the war, there was no distinction between shoes. The invention came about in 1563 or 64, making walking much more comfortable. Soldiers were even able to choose while they were here between one of 4 sizes of shoes, so they were much more comfortable than everybody else was. There were even 4 laundresses for each company of soldiers, and you know they were important because they were paid about $26 a month, which was twice the rate of the average soldier. So they were getting paid twice as much to do all of their laundry. As I mentioned, this was a pretty comfortable place to be stationed. They even had time for parades and balls and picnics. Apparently May Day of 1863 was a particularly fun event. They had a picnic on the beach with decorations and food like ham and cake and lobster and cookies and berries and cream, and it was a whole list of snacks that they enjoyed. They also played violin and tambourine and banjo music for dancing, so it was quite a big party for the middle of a war. After the Confederate surrender, some troops stayed in Fernandina Beach even after the war was over to carry out and enforce Reconstruction policies and voting laws, as well as continue the construction of Fort Clinch that still wasn't completed at this point. We were one of the first places to hold an election that included both black and white voters. Of course, women couldn't vote, but it was still a momentous step for the area. Adolphus Mott won the mayoral election, and a Supreme Court justice came down to swear him in since it was such a big occasion. Many soldiers decided to come back after the war, bringing their families for vacations or settling down and starting businesses, seeing opportunity in the area. Because there weren't many battles on the island, we quickly reached a new normal and started establishing ourselves as a resort town, kicking off what became our first big tourism boom. As I start to wrap up, I've got a couple of notes on how things kind of ended up in some shameless plugs. I think of this kind of at the end of a movie when they tell you how everybody ended up a couple of years later. Fort Clinch was never truly completed. Construction stopped only a few years after the war in 1867, and the Army retained control of the fort for years, storing munitions and housing soldiers in it throughout the Spanish-American War. Fernandina Beach continued to hold black and white integrated elections, even electing numerous black public officials in the year after the war until Jim Crow laws took effect. Fernandina Beach spent most of Reconstruction building up the town to support the weekly steamships full of tourists coming into town. If you're interested in learning more about the historic buildings that were built around this time period, both before and after the war, I highly recommend taking one of the walking tours, and this is my shameless plug, because they go into a lot of detail about the architecture of the buildings and then the people who lived inside of them and how they interacted and built the town to be what it is now. A lot of the names that you'll hear about the homes around town are the ones that were either stationed here or had left and come back after the war. So you get to know a lot more about these characters that span even up until recent history as well. And the very last thing I guess I should say before I completely wrap up is a huge thank you to Rhonda specifically, and then Isabel Villa and Bill Birdsong for their help in helping me uncover a lot of this research. The archives here at the museum have a ton of information, and they're constantly adding to them with more. And so Rhonda being able to help me understand how to access them, how to get into the files and all of that was incredibly helpful. So a huge thank you for all of that help and for taking a look at it and everything. I will open it up for questions now. I think I probably talked really fast and blew through everything. So if y'all have any questions, let me know. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. That was very informative. I noticed you used the term Fernandina Beach
Yes.
a lot. But I think there were two different towns, if I understand it right. Fernandina is by the river, and there was a separate Fernandina Beach on the ocean. And they were two separate towns for a long time. And it wasn't until the 50s that Fernandina took on the name Fernandina Beach when they combined the two. So I would just encourage you to use the term Fernandina for all this historical stuff.
Yes, I'm sorry. I should have probably specified at the beginning. I've been using the more current nomenclature, but yeah, I was speaking more of Fernandina, the town on this side of the island. But then also speaking of, when we were talking about the Union troops coming in and being stationed here, it wasn't just Fort Clinch, it was throughout the island, even on the south side of the island, and in the beach section as well too. So, but yeah, thank you. I should have probably prefaced that at the beginning. Yes.
Could you, during the course of the Civil War, did you have Union troops stationed in any of the buildings downtown? I don't know if there's any evidence that apparently Union soldiers were housed in the Presbyterian Church, or maybe that was a hospital perhaps, or something of that nature.
Yeah.
Did you come across any suggestion that some of the buildings actually provided the living quarters for Union troops here?
Yes, definitely. Some of them were stationed in different places. I know for a fact the Florida House Inn was used to house some of the troops, and then I believe quite a few of the buildings downtown were, I guess, taken over to house people. I don't have a complete list of which ones, but I know, yeah, I think the Presbyterian Church, the Florida House Inn, and then probably quite a few more as well. Just because there was something like 2,000 troops here and not a complete bunkhouse in the fort, so you had to spread out, I guess. And a lot of the buildings hadn't been used and were released as people weren't paying taxes again. And once they evacuated, they were able to resell some of the land and use it for other purposes.
Just as a follow-up, the only evidence I've come across General Grant ever coming here was in the 1868 election. He stayed at the Florida House. Have you been able to confirm that as an actual fact?
Yes, I did see that same story, that he actually had a very positive, I guess, reception here, despite being a Union general and everybody having come back after the war. Everybody was really excited, or gave him a very warm reception when he came to town and stayed at the Florida House Inn. Yes, I did read that same story.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So Ulysses S. Grant, did he stay at the Florida House or the Egmont Hotel?
I read the Florida House Inn, but that was based on the information I read. And I should also say, I know a lot of y'all are experts in here. If I'm saying something, jump in if you guys know details. But I read the Florida House Inn was where he had stayed. Okay. That's fine.
During the Civil War, weren't there women working here at the fort?
At the fort? Yes.
They were doing the housekeeping.
Yep. Laundry and that kind
Who
of
were
thing.
they? How did they get here?
That's a good question. My assumption, and I don't have an actual document to point to that says this, but is that some of them were probably some of those residents that had stayed, but there was a lot of widows and refugees that came to the area that were seeking, employment or seeking ways to provide for themselves and their children. I would imagine that's probably a lot of where they were employed was through the fort.
Also, there's always reference to Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
Do you have anything on that?
I don't have a specific one to point to, but it's apparently been documented in multiple journal entries from soldiers at Fort Clinch that she was here and was treating dysentery among the troops, because she was known for her herbal remedies and things like that she was using as a nurse.
There's no written.
Not that I was able to find. I want to do more research. I mean, I'm sure it's somewhere in the archives. It's just hard to pinpoint exactly where, and then also very hard for me to read the writing. Some of these old, as you saw in Walcott's letter here, some of the writing is a little messy, but it is in there. I just have to keep looking. Yeah, that's true.
When you start Googling, they have news for you. Sometimes you get really lost. You have to go to the right sources.
Yeah, I'll also say these are some of the sources that I used, and then the archives here, you can access a lot of them online. They're still digitizing quite a few of them, but they are searchable, and you can try to find information that way as well. And then Rhonda is a archivist here. She can help you find very specifically exactly what you're looking for and help with all of that kind of stuff as well. So if Google leads you astray, the museum can always put you back on track. So, yeah.
Whatever became of General Finnegan you talked about?
Yes.
What became of him post-war?
He came back to the island, and he was originally here working with the railroad, was what brought him to town, because he was the construction manager for that. He came back, I believe he got his house back, and continued out, I think, working when the railroad started to get rebuilt and the town started to rebuild. I think he just came back after the war, unless somebody knows differently. That's another one I should probably look up a little further. Yes.
With all the health problems, potential health problems, the threats that the soldiers had to put up with, how was the health generally? Were there any deaths from disease?
There were. There was deaths not only among soldiers and stuff, but just local townspeople. There was a lot about Chloe Merrick and those children and families who were malnourished and weren't, they had smallpox, they had things like that were going around. So illness was definitely an issue, but not in comparison to where they were more fighting up north. It was a much healthier place to be. You still had like malaria and things like that were specific to the bugs in the area that you were getting, that made this a unique spot. But it didn't seem to be particularly a dangerous place, illness-wise, to be stationed. Yes, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I thought I read, I might be mistaken, but it was African Americans from Florida, maybe even Fernandina, that were the first to form a regiment for the Union. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about the order, like if they were first, but we were a huge recruiting spot, and so there's quite a few that were mentioned by name in letters from generals and things praising their strength and their, valor and things like that. So there's quite a few notable soldiers from the area. I don't know if they were the very first, but I know they sent people immediately. There was, I think it was 300 or so the first, as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, sent 300 or so, because I think they were forming in South Carolina, so they recruited here and sent them north to go fight. Yes?
Did you run across any information about the relationship between the town government and the Northern Army at the time? Were there rules that were laid down by the Army for the townspeople to abide by? Were there any little plots or anything that the townspeople might have been thinking about hatching against the Army or anything like that?
Honestly, I did not read much about that, and I think it's because, or at least my understanding based on what I read, was that the people that were left, the 200 residents who didn't evacuate, were probably ones that sided with the Union, that believed, aligned with the federal troops, I guess, taking over. So there wasn't, apart from that first coming in and kind of ransacking the town and getting comfortable, wasn't a ton of conflict, and you can see by 1863 that they were having parties and things like that and getting along fairly well together. And you'll even see coming back after the war that a lot of the Union troops that were here, soldiers that came back, had made relationships with other townspeople and ended up building homes together, using them for construction purposes and things like that. So it seemed like a fairly, apart from that first taking over period, a fairly friendly relationship between the town and the Union troops. But I didn't really read anything fun or scandalous about, them not getting along, I guess.
You've got an interesting looking book up there listed Beechers, Stows, and Yankee Strangers, the Transformation of Florida. So what, can you give a little hint as to what that's all about?
Yeah, I did not read the whole book, to be fair. I cited a couple of things out of it and actually found it through the archives here at the museum. They've got pictures taken, but it went into quite a bit of detail about Chloe Merrick and her story and coming down and opening the orphanage, and then she got married here and moved on and did things throughout the rest of Northeast Florida. So that's where I got a lot of her stories, not so much, I guess she was one of the Yankee strangers, but I did not read the whole book for this.
Well, yeah, because that would be the abolitionists coming to Florida doing this Freedmen's Bureau type of.
Yes, and that's who brought her down here and eventually closed down the orphanage as well. Because they had to the war ended, they had to figure out, they sold off all of these pieces of land to people, like Chloe Merrick to use as orphanages or to use their land. And now they're back after the war, and so Finnegan started to fight back and ask for his home back. And so the Freedmen's Bureau actually is the one who recommended moving her south to Jacksonville.
You've got the Gettysburg compiler. Florida has a really nice memorial at the Gettysburg battlefield because there's a Florida unit that fought there. But were there any Confederate soldiers from here that fought and were any brought back for burial during the war or came back after the war?
There were definitely ones that fought, because I guess Finnegan was up fighting with Lee's army at some point up in Virginia. And there was definitely a few who came back. I don't know of any burials specifically, and maybe y'all know more who are helping with the Graveside Chronicles bit might know more about it, who's buried where, but definitely some soldiers came from this area and returned back after the war. But also some didn't as well, because I could go into all the houses and information and stuff too, but the Lassane house that is on Center Street was built pre-war, and he did not make it back after the war, which prompted its sale.
Any famous Northern Union's generals, did they visit here during the war?
Lee was the main one. I guess that's Confederate. I guess. Union one. Not really. I don't think it was Colonel DuPont, who was the Union guy in control of the takeover of the fort. But Florida really wasn't a big target. I mean, the Union troops had the blockade on Florida, but there weren't a lot of people here, and they were much more focused further north where there was more interest. Once they had control of Fort Clinch, there really wasn't much need to pay much attention to this area, so I don't think it ever attracted any other major Union officers.
It's mainly to protect the coast.
Yeah. And they were, I think, much more focused on, I mean, since this was such an easy spot, there were much more contentious areas just south of us trying to get into what's the name of that? There's, where the blockade runners would hide. It's just a little bit south of us, one of the rivers. But anyway, they were much more focused down there, so it was too quiet, I think, to draw much attention. Yes.
I'm curious about the railroad.
Yes.
What was the purpose for it? Was it to bring people back and forth, or was it to bring merchandise, or?
I
Yeah.
invite you to come to the
Yeah.
exhibit.
You really set her up perfectly.
All right, I'll keep it down.
September 20th.
The quick
6
version,
o'clock.
you should definitely come back because it'll go in way more depth and way more information, but the quick version was mostly to bring goods and supplies back and forth. They had goods like cedar and things like that, so it was connecting that side of Florida over here because there weren't any big roads or any kind of transportation.
Yeah.
But then also, if you are trying to get to anywhere on the Gulf Coast at this point in time, you had to go all the way down around the Keys by ship and then come back up the
Yeah.
Gulf Coast, which was extremely dangerous and time consuming. So building the railroad opened up pretty much the whole Gulf Coast to trade and all of that kind of.
Yeah, because I don't know when Flagler was
It
in.
was after that.
Yeah, that was after, right? Quite a bit
Yes.
after.
And that's another whole, that's I
Yeah.
guess probably the next talk, but about.
And if you want to look behind you, you
Yeah.
have a map
Oh,
of
yeah.
Florida.
Okay.
And that was for your Bell Road, but you can see that visually visions, the dots you see,
Yeah.
that's the Bell Road that was crossing from east to
East
west.
to- east to west,
So
yeah.
the ships will avoid going all around.
Yeah.
Right at the peninsula.
Yeah, definitely. And then if.
Thank you.
To the spoiler for the next speech is, yeah, Henry Flagler comes in and puts our big tourism boom to bed, but.
Oh.
Yes. I'll come back up here in a second. Yes.
Had a question, but just answered it. But I wanted to comment about Harriet Tubman.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you stumbled across it yet, but she has a biography that was written, really just quoting her, just an interview style by an abolitionist friend of hers. But even the abolitionist author, being her friend, said you really can't trust these black people. So I verified Harriet's claim. Harriet wrote in her book that she came down to Fernandina and ministered with plants in a nurse capacity. And then in the back of the book, they haven't read it in a while, but I believe the author attached 2 letters. One from a general affirming that she had been in Fernandina doing this nursing role and spying.
Yeah.
And then there was another letter, I think by the Secretary of the Army or some high ranking commander, that was petitioning for her to get a pension as an employee of the Union Army.
Wow, I'm gonna have to go look that up. I can't believe I didn't find that on the first part. Yeah, there's the proof right there, I guess. That's awesome. And the whole spy part of it too, I feel like is fascinating, that she was spying in the area for us.
Because she could transverse, from the south and down here. On the south road, she had her way to transverse easily, but then she was helped because she was a nurse and because she was so highly respected.
Yeah.
So she'd go into an area and really gather intelligence about what the Confederacy was doing like nobody else could.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, it's an amazing story. And cool that she was here too. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
How you very briefly mentioned the Harrison Plantation. After the war, and when they were trying to rebuild commerce on Fernandina, was there any effort to rebuild anything? Because Amelia City was actually a little port at that time. Anything on the south end, or did the Harrisons just leave and the entire plantation sat vacant for 80 years or whatever? Or?
Well, the part that I read, and somebody else can jump into if I'm telling this incorrectly, but there was a field order issued saying that plantation land could be used by the freed people that had worked there. So the freed slaves could take that land and use it for their own purposes and all of that. And that's where Franklintown came from, which eventually, I mean, if you still look at the map now, it says Franklintown if you drive south on the island, right there kind of by American Beach. And so from my understanding, that's what that turned into was Franklin Town more so than re-establishing the
That's
plantation.
why there was never an effort to reestablish plantation.
Not that I know,
Or
yeah, I thought
farming
that was-
or agriculture. for
Yeah.
that matter.
There might have been, I mean, some farming, I would say, but I've never heard anything about the Harrisons coming back, I don't think, unless someone else knows more.
They were probably from Boston or New York anyway, so they.
Yeah, yeah, well, and you wouldn't have the same, I mean, if you had all of that land down there operating with slaves, there's no way to maintain that without, the same way you had pre-war, so they would have to come up with a new strategy or a new way to farm that kind of property. Any other questions or anything? Yes.
I just want to thank you so very much on behalf of all these young people in the room like me. You did a wonderful job. Of course, you're all younger than me anyway, but you did a magnificent job. It was really extraordinary, and I appreciate, and we all appreciate very much the work you've done, and you've done as well, young lady over there. So thank you all very much. It was a great event.
Come to the opening on the September 20th sign, because you'll learn a lot more about the railroad.